The last time I saw my younger sister look truly happy was at her wedding, 23 years ago. She wore a cream-colored dress with tiny pearl buttons running all the way up the back, and she laughed so loud during the reception that the photographer missed half his shots. I remember thinking, standing there in my rented suit with my bad knee already aching from the ceremony, that she had finally found someone worth keeping. I was wrong about that. It just took me a long time to find out how wrong. My name is not important. What matters is that I spent 31 years as a detective with the Chicago PD, the last 9 of those working financial crimes. I know how people hide money. I know how they isolate a target. I know the exact moment when someone stops being a partner and starts being a warden. The signs are always the same. I just never expected to see them in my own sister's house. Her name is Eleanor. She is 61 years old, 3 years younger than me, and she has a laugh that can fill a room even when the room doesn't deserve it. She married a man named Philip, who owned a chain of dry cleaning businesses across the northern suburbs of Chicago. Not wealthy by any dramatic standard, but comfortable, steady. When Philip died of a stroke 4 years ago, he left Eleanor the house in Wilmette, a life insurance policy worth just over $400,000, and a daughter named Cassandra, who had recently married a man I had never trusted from the moment I shook his hand. His name was Stuart. I want to be precise about that, because everything that happened, every single moment of it, started and ended with Stuart. I met him at a 4th of July cookout in Eleanor's backyard, maybe 8 months before Philip got sick. He was 34 then, Cassandra's age, and he had the kind of handshake that's too firm on purpose, like he'd practiced it in a mirror. He sold commercial real estate and talked about it constantly, dropping numbers into conversation the way some men drop names. I watched him that afternoon, old habit. I watched the way he steered Cassandra away from conversation she was enjoying. I watched the way he refilled Eleanor's wine glass a half beat before it was empty, always right there, always attentive in that particular way that is less about kindness and more about staying in the room. After dinner, he asked me about my career. I told him I was retired. He asked what I did before that, and I told him general law enforcement, which was not entirely a lie. He smiled and nodded and changed the subject, and I noticed that he never asked a single follow-up question. People who are confident ask follow-up questions. People who are performing confidence do not. I didn't say any of this to Eleanor. She loved Cassandra. Cassandra loved Stuart, or believed she did, and that was enough for Eleanor to keep her mouth closed and her wine glass full and her opinions to herself. That was always her way. Then Philip died, and everything shifted. I don't know exactly when Stuart started managing Eleanor's finances. I don't know if there was a specific conversation, or if it happened the way these things often do, gradually, and then all at once, the frog in the water that doesn't jump because the temperature rises so slowly. What I know is that by the time I drove down from Milwaukee 18 months after Philip's funeral, something in Eleanor had gone quiet, in a way that frightened me more than anything I had seen in 31 years on the job. She had lost weight. She didn't need to lose. Her kitchen, which had always smelled like something good, was either happening or recently finished, smelled like nothing. She moved carefully through her own house, the way people move when they are guests somewhere. She laughed once during the 2 days I visited, and it was the polite kind of laugh, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. I asked her directly on the second morning, sitting at her kitchen table with coffee. She apologized for making wrong, whether she was okay. She said she was just tired. Grief does that, she said. I said Philip had been gone a year and a half. She looked at her coffee cup and said that some people grieve longer than others. That night I called Cassandra to ask if her mother was seeing a doctor. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Cassandra told me Eleanor was fine, that I was projecting, that retirement gave me too much time to worry. Stuart's voice came through in the background at one point, and Cassandra's whole tone shifted slightly, the way a thermostat clicks when the temperature drops. She said she had to go and that she would pass along my concern. I drove back to Milwaukee, and I sat in my apartment for 3 days, and I thought about what I had seen and what I had not been able to prove. Then Eleanor called me. It was a Tuesday night, late, and she was whispering. I had to press the phone hard against my ear to hear her. She said that she had tried to access her savings account online to pay her property tax and found that her login credentials no longer worked. She said she had called the bank and been told that a secondary account manager had changed the access permissions. She said she hadn't authorized that. She said she had mentioned it to Cassandra, and Cassandra had said Stuart was just consolidating things to make it easier, that Eleanor didn't need to worry about it, that everything was taken care of. She said the words, "Everything is taken care of," in a tone that told me everything was not taken care of. I asked her one question. I asked her if she wanted help. There was a long pause. I could hear her breathing in the dark of her bedroom in the house she had lived in for 27 years. She said, "Yes. I want to be clear about something. I am 64 years old. I have 2 replaced discs in my lower back and a knee that predicts rain better than any meteorologist in the Midwest. I retired for reasons, several of them medical, and the life I have built in Milwaukee is quiet and small, and mostly good. I run 2 miles 3 mornings a week. I cook dinner for myself and occasionally for my neighbor, a widower named Frank, who makes excellent chili and terrible decisions about television. I am not the man I was at 40, but I was also a detective for 31 years and financial crimes for 9 of those, and I know exactly how to walk into a situation without announcing that I have walked into it. I told Eleanor I was going to come stay with her for a while. I told her to tell Cassandra that I had been having some health issues and needed a change of scenery. I told her not to mention anything about the bank account to anyone. She said she understood. I drove down on a Thursday. Stuart and Cassandra lived 12 minutes from Eleanor's house, in a newer development in Glenview, close enough to be present but far enough to be separate, which I had already filed away as relevant. Stuart came by the evening I arrived, which I had also expected. He stood in Eleanor's kitchen with his hands in his pockets and told me it was great to see me and that Eleanor had been doing so much better lately. He said he and Cassandra worried about her living alone and that they checked in as often as they could. He said he hoped my house situation wasn't too serious. I told him it was nothing to worry about. I smiled the way I had learned to smile in interview rooms, which is to say warmly and without showing anything at all. He left after 40 minutes. I watched Eleanor watch him leave, and I recognized the particular quality of her relief, the kind that is physical, the shoulders dropping half an inch, the breath going all the way down to the stomach. That night, I asked her to tell me everything from the beginning, without editing anything out. It took 2 hours. Stuart had positioned himself as the helpful son-in-law in the months after Philip died, which was not unusual in itself. He had helped Eleanor navigate the estate paperwork, which was genuinely complex. He had accompanied her to the bank when she moved Philip's accounts. He had introduced her to his own financial advisor, a man named Peter, who wore expensive shirts and spoke with the particular fluency of someone who knows how to make complicated things sound simple, and simple things sound complicated. Eleanor had signed documents she had not fully read because Stuart was there, and Stuart seemed to understand them, and Stuart was family. 18 months of small transfers and adjusted permissions and shifted account structures later, Eleanor could not pay her own property tax without asking Stuart first. Her health insurance premium had been missed twice. Both times Stuart had paid it temporarily, and both times he had mentioned it afterward in a way that was technically informational and functionally a reminder of her dependence. Her car registration had lapsed for 6 weeks because the renewal notice had gone to an email address Stuart had set up for her, and that Stuart checked. When she had asked about switching back to her original email, Cassandra had become upset and said that Eleanor didn't appreciate everything they were doing for her. I asked Eleanor if she had any documentation. Old bank statements, account numbers, anything with her name on it from before. She went to the hall closet and came back with a shoebox. It was more than I had expected and exactly what I needed. I spent the next 3 days very carefully not looking like what I was. I made breakfast. I fixed the weather stripping on the back door that had been loose since before Philip died. I went to the grocery store and bought good bread and the kind of sharp cheddar that Eleanor has always liked more than she admits. I walked the neighborhood in the mornings, slowly because my knee required it, and because walking slowly is one of the best ways to see things clearly. Stuart came by 4 times in those 3 days, always with a reason. Once to drop off a casserole Cassandra had made. Once to check on a gutter he said was pulling away from the fascia. Once with paperwork for Eleanor to sign, which she told him she wanted to look over first, and which produced a silence of about 3 seconds that told me more than the paperwork itself. The fourth time was just to say hello, which nobody does without a reason. He was monitoring the situation. He wanted to see how I fit into it. He was deciding whether I was a complication. On the third night, Eleanor got a call from Peter, the financial advisor, who said he needed her to come in and sign updated beneficiary designations on 2 of her accounts. This was almost certainly legitimate paperwork used to create illegitimate urgency. I told Eleanor to call back and say she was feeling under the weather and would reschedule. She did. Then I called a former colleague of mine, a woman named Renata, who had moved from Chicago PD to the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation, and who owed me, professionally speaking, a significant favor. I gave Renata the names, the account information from the shoebox, and my read on the situation. She said she would look into it quietly. She said it might take some time. I said I understood and thanked her, and then I did something that was not official and not part of any process, and that I am not entirely sorry about. Stuart came by the next morning alone, without a reason I could see. Eleanor was at the pharmacy 2 blocks away. I invited him in. I made coffee. We sat at the same kitchen table where Eleanor had apologized for her coffee 5 weeks earlier, and I let him talk for a while, which he was good at, and I watched the way his eyes moved to the hall closet twice in 15 minutes, which told me he had some sense that a shoebox might exist. I said casually that I had been helping Eleanor get her documents organized. I said old people, present company included, tended to let paperwork pile up. I said I had found some interesting old statements. He held very still. Good conversationalists go still when they're recalculating. I said I had been thinking about calling an old colleague at the State Financial Regulatory Office, just to ask some general questions about account management and elder financial oversight, not about anything specific, just general questions, the kind you'd ask to make sure everything was being handled by the book. I said I liked things to be by the book. Old cop habit. He said that was very thorough of me. I said I thought so. He stayed another 7 minutes and then left. I sat there and drank my coffee and thought about the specific quality of his exit, which was controlled and slightly faster than his arrival. 2 days later, Cassandra called Eleanor in tears. She said Stuart had told her that I was interfering, that I didn't trust them, that I was treating them like criminals when all they had ever done was try to help. Eleanor listened. I sat across from her at the kitchen table and watched her face. I watched her remember the missed insurance premiums and the email she couldn't access, and the 3 seconds of silence when she asked to read a document before signing it. She told Cassandra that she loved her. She told Cassandra that she loved her own access to her own accounts restored. She told Cassandra that this was not a negotiation. The silence on Cassandra's end lasted long enough that I found myself holding my breath. Then Cassandra said quietly that she hadn't known about some of this. She said Stuart had told her Eleanor had asked him to handle things. She said she thought Eleanor had been overwhelmed and grateful. Eleanor said that she had been overwhelmed. She said overwhelmed and grateful were not the same as signing things over. I want to say here that I've done enough of this work to know that people like Cassandra are not always villains. Sometimes they are people who trusted the wrong person and told themselves a story that made the trust feel like help. That is its own kind of failure, but it is a different kind than Stuart's. Cassandra came over 2 days later without Stuart. She and Eleanor sat in the living room for 3 hours. I found reasons to be in other parts of the house. When I came back through to refill my water glass, Cassandra was crying and Eleanor had her hand on her daughter's knee, and the quality of it was the kind of grief that is also relief, the kind where you finally say the real thing out loud, and the world does not end. Renata called me that evening. She said her office had found irregularities in the account restructuring, specifically in the way the power of attorney documentation had been filed. She said the financial advisor, Peter, had a prior disciplinary action on his license that had not been disclosed. She said there was enough to open a formal investigation and that Eleanor would need to make a statement. Eleanor made the statement. It took 4 hours and she was exhausted afterward, but she made it completely. The property in Glenview did not get investigated because that was not what the investigation was about. What happened to Stuart's marriage? I cannot tell you with precision because some of that is still being settled. and because Cassandra is Eleanor's daughter and what happens between them is not mine to report. What I can tell you is that Peter surrendered his license. What I can tell you is that a civil suit was filed on Eleanor's behalf to recover what had been moved. What I can tell you is that Eleanor's original account access was restored in full within 30 days of Renata's office opening its inquiry. I stayed in Wilmette for 6 weeks total. I fixed the gutter, which was in fact pulling away from the fire. I made chili, which was not as good as Frank's, but which Eleanor said was the best she'd had in years, which is the kind of generous lie that sisters tell. I watched her laugh at the television 2 nights in a row. The real laugh. The one that doesn't apologize for taking up space. The morning I drove back to Milwaukee, she walked me to my car. It was March, still cold. The way Chicago is cold, the wind coming off the lake like it has a personal objection to you. She was wearing the heavy cardigan she's had since the 90s, and she had her arms crossed against the chill, and she looked, for the first time since Philip died, like herself. She said thank you. She said she was sorry she hadn't called sooner. I told her that was what brothers were for. She laughed and told me not to make it sentimental. I got in the car and I drove north, and I thought about what it costs a person to ask for help when they've spent a lifetime not needing to. I thought about the shoebox in the hall closet, all those years of paperwork Eleanor had kept without knowing why, and how sometimes the things we hold on to without understanding why turn out to be exactly what saves us. My knee ached the whole drive home. The sky was the flat grey that means more winter is coming. I had the radio on low and the heater running, and I felt, underneath the tiredness and the aching me and the long weeks away from my own small quiet life, something that I can only describe as satisfied. Not because I had done anything dramatic, not because anyone would ever make a movie about a 64-year-old retired detective sitting at a kitchen table drinking coffee and mentioning a regulatory office in a tone of voice, but because my sister laughed like herself again, and because the man who had quietly dismantled her autonomy while calling it love was now explaining himself to people whose job it is to write things down. That is enough. At my age, with my knee, in my life, that is more than enough. The thing about a shoebox full of old bank statements is that it shouldn't be the thing that saves you. Eleanor had kept that box in the hall closet for years without knowing why. The way people hold on to things that once mattered without being able to name the reason anymore. And then one night she needed it, and it was there. That's not luck. That's a lifetime of quiet, careful habit. The kind of integrity that doesn't make noise but doesn't disappear either. Stuart counted on her not having it. He counted on the paperwork being gone, the memory being soft, the gratitude being stronger than the suspicion. He had read Eleanor as someone who would rather keep the peace than demand an accounting. He was not entirely wrong about her nature. He was completely wrong about her limits. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not what I did, sitting at a kitchen table, drinking coffee, mentioning a regulatory office in a steady voice, but what Eleanor did. She made that phone call. She whispered in the dark of her own bedroom, in the house she had lived in for 27 years, and she asked for help. That took more courage than anything I did in 6 weeks in Wilmette. I walked in with 31 years of experience and nothing to lose. She walked out of a silence she had been living inside for 18 months, not knowing if anyone would believe her, not knowing if her own daughter would choose her. That is not a small thing. That is the hardest thing. I have seen what happens to people who cannot make that call. I worked enough cases to know the isolation compounds, the dependency deepens. The person who is being diminished begins, slowly and then completely, to believe the diminishment is deserved. Stuart did not need to be violent. Control rarely does once it gets going. He just needed Eleanor to feel like the problem was hers to manage quietly, and he had 18 months of small maneuvers to make her feel exactly that way. What stopped it was not my background or Renata's office or the civil suit. What stopped it was Eleanor deciding, in the dark, that she was worth a phone call. That is a moral clarity that has nothing to do with credentials and everything to do with knowing, even when everything around you is designed to make you forget, that you have a right to your own life. Cassandra is the part of this I think about most carefully. She is not a villain in this story, and I want to be precise about that. She is someone who trusted a version of events that was designed to be trusted and who did not ask the questions that would have broken that version open. That is a failure of a different kind. Not malice, but the avoidance of looking too closely at something that might require her to act. Most of us have been there in some smaller way. Most of us have told ourselves that things were probably fine because investigating them felt like a disruption we weren't ready for. The difference between Cassandra before that afternoon in the living room and after it is that she finally looked. She sat across from her mother, and she listened instead of explained. And what she heard was enough to undo 18 months of a story she had accepted without examining. That shift, from managing a situation to actually seeing it, is the thing I hope stays with her longer than the legal proceedings or the arguments that followed. Eleanor has her accounts back. She has her email. She paid her property tax herself, online, without asking anyone's permission. And she called me afterward just to say that she had done it, and I could hear in her voice that it mattered more than the amount. Some things are only small from the outside. I am 64 years old, and I have a bad knee and a quiet life in Milwaukee, and I did not fix my sister's situation by being exceptional. I fixed it by showing up, paying attention, and using what I knew. That is available to more people than they realize. The hard part is deciding that the person in trouble is worth the disruption of your own ordinary days. Eleanor was always worth it. She just needed me to already know that before she remembered it herself.